All right, on to Chilperic the First. Now, in the previous, we were talking about his wife who was murdered with the suspicion it was his new wife. All right. France did not long enjoy the advantages that were expected to result from the late agreement between the three royal brothers. The death of Galfuinda excited a civil war that seemed to threaten the destruction of Chilperic, Sigebert, and Gontran, at the pressing solicitation of Queen Brunehaut, entering into a league for the purpose of inflicting vengeance on the assassin of her her sister. All right, because remember the sister was killed, who was the wife. They had even seized the greatest part of his dominions, when tranquillity and concord were suddenly restored, not from motives of affection, but interest. It was stipulated by treaty that the King of Soissons should cede to the Queen of Austrasia those domains which had been given to Galwinda for her dower. When this dispute was settled, Sigebert found himself obliged to take up arms against the Huns, now the Hungarians, who had renewed their depredations on the French territories beyond the Rhine. The expedition proved unfortunate. The king, abandoned by his soldiers, was surrounded by the enemy and taken prisoner. He was a prince of extraordinary prudence, and his person was peculiarly calculated to conciliate esteem. His liberality overcame those whom his arms could not subdue. The barbarians, won by his munificence, restored him to liberty, entered into an alliance with him, swore never to molest him more, and loaded him with marks of their friendship and kindness. During these transactions beyond the Rhine, the Lombards, who had recently founded a new kingdom in Italy, made an irruption into Burgundy, defeated and slew the governor, cut the army of Gontran in pieces, and repassed the Alps with an immense booty. A thirst for plunder, joined to the impunity of their first attempt, soon induced them to make a second incursion into Dauphiné. Momol, the greatest warrior then in France, surprised them in the vicinity of Embrun and gained a complete victory. At this engagement, an incident occurred which at that time was unexampled. Salonius and Sagittarius, both of them bishops, the first of Embrun, the second of Gap, changed their mitras for helmets and charged the enemy, sword in hand, with an intrepidity in a soldier. Intrepidness, we don't use these words so much anymore, do we? Intrepidity, that in a soldier would have excited the warmest commendation, but which was universally blamed in a prelate. The eruption of the Lombards was followed by an invasion of the Saxons, who had assisted them in the conquest of Italy. Momol marched against this new enemy, dispersed their army, took from them all the booty they had collected, and compelled them to return to their own country, which they were obliged to divide with the Suevi, who had taken possession of it during their absence. So a lot of war going back and forth here with Italy back into Burgundy. So quite a distance. While Burgundy was thus harassed by the incursion of the barbarians, the king of Austrasia, seduced by the tempting opportunity, seized the city of Arles, to which he had some claims, but it was speedily retaken, and the Australasian army defeated. The conquerors then attacked Avignon, which belonged to the dominions of Segeberg, but Gontran restored it on the conclusion of a peace. This unexpected accommodation was highly disagreeable to the king of Soissons, who, profiting by their dispute, had made an irruption into the territories of Segeberg. Clovis, the youngest of his sons, had reduced Tours and Poitiers. When Momol appeared at the head of those troops, who had so recently signalized their courage against the Lombards and Saxons, the mere presence of this general sufficed to disperse the army of Chilperic and re-establish tranquility and subordination. They finished the first campaign. The next exhibited one of those examples of an aptitude to violate the most sacred treaties, which were but too common with the children of Clovis. Theodebert, notwithstanding his oaths never more to bear arms against his uncle, committed depredations in Touraine, then entered Poitou, defeated the army of Segeberg, and having made himself master of all the towns near the Loire, advanced into Quercy and Limousin, where he laid everything to waste. The king of Australasia, alarmed at the rapidity of his progress, brought a foreign army into France, composed of Germans, Suevi, Bavarians, Thuringians, and Saxons. Chilperic, unable to face so formidable a force, and abandoned by Gontran, who had first joined him, retreated, and entrenched himself in the Chartrain, from whence he sent proposals of peace to his brother. Through this mediation of the French nobles, an accommodation was effected, and the three brothers swore to maintain a perpetual amity. The German troops, who had fed themselves with the hope of plundering the camp of Chilperic, finding themselves disappointed, began to murmur. But Sigebert, mounting his horse, rode along the ranks and ordered the most seditious to be arrested and stoned to death in sight of the whole army. This is the only example to be found in the French history of this species of punishment, which was common among the ancient Romans. All right. Okay, 575. The king of Austrasia had no sooner dismissed his troops than Chilperic and his son Theodebert again took up arms. The former entered Champagne and laid the whole country waste with fire and sword, spreading destruction around him wherever he went. the latter marched into Aquitaine, where he was killed in action. The death of Theodebert, the reconciliation of Gontran with Segebert, and the approach of the German troops filled the court of Soissons with consternation and dismay. Chilperic fled to Tournai, where he shut himself up with his wife and children. Our Stratian prince was everywhere successful. Paris, Rouen, and all the cities and towns belonging to his brother submitted to his arms and acknowledged his authority. Inflated by success, he became deaf to the suggestions of pity. So he became deaf to the suggestions of pity and determined to punish the treachery of his brother with death. The remonstrances of Germanus, the prayers of Fredegonda and the wishes of the nation all proved inadequate to superinduce the adoption of more moderate sentiments. Tournai was already invested when two ruffians hired for the purpose of Fredegonda assassinated Sigebert at Vitry, whither he had repaired in order to receive the homage of his new subjects. Thus perished, in the midst of victory, the most perfect monarch that had yet appeared on the throne of France, generous, liberal, and beneficent. No sovereign had established a more extensive sway over the hearts of his subjects. Intrepid in the hour of danger, and unshaken by adversity, he had the art, even in captivity, to conciliate and respect and affection of the conqueror, who scarcely possessed the appearance of humanity. That sentence was a toughie. He had the art, even in captivity, to conciliate the respect and affection of a conqueror, who scarcely possessed the appearance of humanity. In manners chaste, his inclinations conformed to his situation, and he was never known, like his brothers, to fix his attachment on objects, the meanness of whose extraction could degrade the dignity of his rank. His reign may be justly denominated the reign of decency and honour. Sigebert died in the 41st year of his age, and the 15th of his reign. He was buried in the church of Saint Médard at Soissons, where his figure may still be seen. On his tomb, he is there represented with a long coat, and that species of cloak which the Romans call chlamé, probably chlamé. These dress were worn by all the children of Clovis, either because they thought it had a more noble and majestic appearance, or because they considered the title of Auguste as hereditary in their family. Be that as it may, long coats were, during several centuries, peculiar to persons of distinction. They were generally trimmed with martine, sable, or ermine. Ruffs and collars were introduced by Henry II. Till then, most of the French monarchs had their necks entirely bare. The short coat, which was formerly confined to the country and camp, became fashionable during the reign of Louis XI. It was exploded in that of Louis XII and renewed under Francis I. The favourite dress of Henry II and his children consisted of a close doublet, a kind of half-trouser, such as are worn by the pages in Spain, and a short cloak that did not reach below the waist. The dress of the French ladies experienced as many revolutions as that of the men. It does not appear that they bestowed much pains on the decoration of their persons till towards the conclusion of the 9th century. Their headdress was extremely simple, and their linen plain, but fine. Lace was long unknown to them. Their gowns, which were adorned on the side with the arms of their husbands, and on the other with those of their own family, were made to fit so tight that they showed every part of the shape, and to come so high that they entirely covered the bosom. The widow's weeds greatly resembled the dress of a modern nun. They did not begin to expose their shoulders to sight till the reign of Charles VI. During the gallant reign of Charles VII, bracelets, necklaces, earrings were introduced. Anne of Brittany rejected with disdain all those frivolous embellishments, while Catherine of Medici was incessantly employed in the invention of new decorations, vanity, luxury, caprice, and coquetry. At length carried them to the height which they have now attained. No revolution was ever more sudden or complete than that which took place on the death of Segeberg. The Austrasian army immediately raised the siege of Tournai. All the towns that had been taken in the kingdom of Soissons returned to their allegiance. Queen Brunehaut and her children were arrested, and Chilperic, after he had recovered his dominions, saw himself on the point of ascending the throne of his conqueror. Sigulfus and several other of the Austrasian nobles had acknowledged him for their sovereign, and their example was followed by Sigo, the grand referendary, that was the title given by the Merovingian kings to the person, page flip, who kept the Great Seal, dispatched letters, and sealed the public ordinances. He was called Chancellor under the Carolingian monarchs, either because he drew his pen across such letters as he rejected, or because he affixed a seal to them in an apartment that was secured with iron bars, or chanceaux, as they were called. It was formerly but the 5th place in the kingdom, and it was not without great difficulty that a seat in the Assembly of the Peers was allowed him in 1224. and for a long time he took his place in the parliament after the princes and prelates. At length he has become the first officer under the crown, president of all the councils and head of all the judges and courts of justice, and dispensator of all favours, abolitions and pardons. He is the only man in the kingdom who does not wear mourning, and the only subject who receives visits without returning them. Chilperic made his entry into Paris, accompanied by a variety of relics, borne in procession. He imagined that his affectation of the religious zeal would avert the malediction to which he had subjected himself. In case he should violate the treaty of division, or at least that the credit of so many saints would prove sufficient to counterbalance the authority of Perluctus, Hilary, and Martin, whom he had called to witness his sincerity. But his surprise and indignation were inexpressible when he learned that the son and sole heir of Sigebert had effected his escape. Gondibald, one of the first nobles at the court of the deceased monarch, had released the infant prince from captivity. He was let down from the window of his prison in a basket and received by a trusty person who delivered to him fate. Oh my gosh, this is getting good. He delivered him safe into the hands of the faithful Austrasian, by whom he was conducted to Metz. The great men of the kingdom assembled on Christmas Day, and Childebert, who had scarcely attained his 6th year, was crowned King of Australia. I won't say it. Austrasia. Okay, so now there is a little child delivered through on a basket out of a prison window. And because of this, do we know this child's name? Well, hopefully they'll come up with a name soon. I don't. It's not Chilperic, I don't believe. Had released the infant prince from captivity, Gondibald. The son and sole heir of Sigebert had elected his escape. I'm not sure. But I'll have to do some study on that one. Which child was it? Enraged at the escape of his prisoner, the king of Soissons seized the treasures of Sigebert and sent Queen Brunehaut to Rouen, where he ordered her to be strictly guarded. But what caused the deepest affliction to this unfortunate mother was the seizure of her daughters, Ingonda and Clodocinda, who were conducted to Meaux, and Maine, and sent his son Merovius to reduce Poitou. The first had orders to seize Gontran, Bosson, whom the king suspected of having killed his eldest son, Theodebert. This officer had fled for refuge to the church of Saint Martin of Tours, an asylum that was more respected than any sanctuary in France. This consideration, however, was inadequate to restrain Roqueline from fulfilling the commands of his master. But his punishment was such a profanation of his sacred place. A profanation, says Gregory of Tours. It was prompt and exemplary. Stricken with sudden terror, he was forced to retire without putting his project in execution, and died a few days later after at Poitiers. Young Merovius, less faithful to the orders of his father, repaired to Tours, and leaving that place under pretence of going to Mons, where his mother Audovera resided. He took the road to Rouen, where Bishop Prextatatus married him to Brunihoe, whose beauty was still in its meridian. Fortunatus, indeed, represents her as a second Venus, and the particulars in which he enters on this subject, prove either that he was not yet a bishop, or the prelates of those days, though irreproachable, perhaps in their manners, were not very delicate in their expressions. So, Brunihoe was a beautiful woman, apparently, same as Venus, a second to her. Chilperic, deeply offended at the conduct of his son, repaired to Rouen with a determination to punish the new married couple, who, alarmed at his approach, took refuge in the church of Saint Martin, built on the ramparts of the city. In vain were every artifice and every stratagem exerted to induce them to quit their asylum. They refused to leave it till they had obtained a most solemn promise, not only that no insult nor injury should be offered them, but that their marriage should be confirmed, in case the bishops should deem it lawful. The king, after this accommodation, obliged Merovius to follow him to Soissons, and left Brunihoe in her former prison, from whence he soon after sent her into Austrasia with the princesses, her daughters. She was no sooner arrived there than she engaged her son Childebert to declare war against his uncle Gaudin, one of the chief nobles of Austrasia. 577. Who had before sworn allegiance to Chilperic, received orders to march to Soissons for the purpose of seizing the person of Fredegonda. But arriving a few hours too late, he was himself surprised, defeated, and slain. This commotion being ascribed to Merovius, they took from him his arms and placed guards over him. The defeat of an army in the Limousin confirmed these suspicions, and entirely deprived him of his father's confidence and affection. Gontran had joined Childebert against the king of Soissons, who had sent two powerful armies to oppose them, one in Saintonge, under the command of his second son Clovis, and the other in the Limousin under the conduct of General Didier. This last was attacked by Mumol, who gained a complete victory after a most bloody and obstinate action, in which 25,000 of Chilperic's troops and 5,000 Burgundians were slain. Okay, 30,000 slain. Merovius, being considered as the author of this war, was made responsible for his consequences. They cut, they cut off his hair, and after he had been disinherited, he was ordained priest and confined to a convent. But escaping from his prison, he fled to the church of Saint Martin at Tours, and Chilperic, all his efforts to make him quit this sanctuary fruitless and unavailing, at length determined to remove him by force. He wrote on his subject to Saint Martin, whose indignation he was fearful of incurring, his letter, which was in the form of consultation, was placed on the tomb of the saint, and the king, such was the simplicity and ignorance of these times, had the precaution to send a piece of plain paper with it, on which he hoped the blessed pontiff would write his decision. But the saint did not honour him with an answer, and the paper being found in statu quo at the expiration of 3 days, the superstitious monarch abandoned his design. All right. Merovius, on his part, implored the protection of the same saint against the rage and machinations of his father. He conjured him to point out his fate by such passages of Scripture as he should open on by chance, but not one of them proved favourable. All, says the historian from whom we take this account, foretold that he would die a violent death. The unhappy prince, after this fatal prediction, was a stranger to Australasia again. Austrasia, sorry, I'm really bad on that one. To rest in tranquility. He was a stranger to that, a fugitive wandering about the country, passing from Touraine to Austrasia, and from Champagne to Artois, abandoned by his wife, whose affection for him was sincere, but who was totally unable to serve him, persecuted by his father, and betrayed by the principal inhabitants of Terouanne. He was at length assassinated by some people in the pays of Fredegonda. All right, so this queen carried her revenge still farther. She had not forgotten the connection that formerly subsisted between Praxiteles and Merovius, and she therefore undertook to procure the disposition of that prelate in a council holden in Paris in the church of Sainte Geneviève. It is difficult to say which was the most calculated to excite astonishment: the situation of the king, who appeared as his accuser, or that of the fathers, who were greatly embarrassed to find any cause for reprehension in the conduct of a bishop who had married an aunt to her nephew. One might be tempted to conclude either that such marriages were not prohibited by the ancient canons, or that the ecclesiastics were persuaded the ordinary had a right to grant dispensations. Our surprise is still augmented when we reflect on the weakness of the party accused, who, at the instigation of some pretended friends, confessed himself guilty of crimes which he had never ever committed. But our astonishment is at its height when we see the king throwing himself at the feet of the prelates, his vassals, to sue for the condemnation of one of his subjects. He wished to have his robes torn off in full council, and to have the maledictions contained in the 108th Psalm repeated to him, or at least to have a sentence of external excommunication pronounced against him. But none of his requests were granted. The bishop, however, was condemned on his own confession, committed to prison, and afterwards banished. On the death of Chilperic, he was recalled by the King of Burgundy and reinstated on his bishopric, in spite of Fredegonda, who in revenge had him stabbed in the midst of divine service. In consequence of this horrid attempt, all the churches in Rouen were shut. The bishops who were there forbade the celebration of the holy mysteries till such time as the author of that sacrilegious deed should be discovered. This is the first instance of such an interdiction in ancient days. But the assassination of Merovius and the condemnation of Pretextatus only served as a prelude to the enormities of Fredegonda. Chilperic had one son by his first wife still living. It was that same Clovis who commanded his father's army in the war against the king of Austrasia. The cruel stepmother resolved to sacrifice this prince to the elevation of her own children. She was first disposed to put her abominable project in execution by the discovery of a conspiracy formed by Ludarste, governor of Tours. The means he employed was so far removed from the common modes of proceeding in such cases that they appeared to be infallible. He suborned witnesses to accuse Gregory of Tours of carrying on a correspondence with Childebert, and of having spoken indecently of the amour of Fredegonda and the Bishop of Bordeaux. Gregory soon cleared himself of these odious imputations. His accusers, being put to the torture, confessed that this intrigue had been feigned for the purpose of inspiring the king with suspicions of his wife's fidelity, and that the design of the conspirators was to assassinate Chilperic, to make away with the children he had by the queen, and to place Clovis on the throne. Though the young prince had no concern in the conspiracy, he was greatly beloved by the people, which was alone sufficient to ensure the hatred of Fredegonda. Having lately here she is, lost 3 children by dysentery, she bribed some persons to swear that Clovis had poisoned them. He was accordingly seized and imprisoned in the castle of Nocy, where he was soon after murdered. His mother, Zayvra, experienced a similar fate, the sacredness of her retreat being insufficient to preserve her from the rage of her assassins. Basina, sister to Clovis and daughter to the reigning monarch, was first dishonoured by infamous hirelings, and then shut up in a convent. The writers of those times tell us that these cruel deeds were preceded by the most evident proofs of the anger of heaven, by earthquakes, inundations, conflagrations, famine, epidemic, diseases, showers of blood, and a total subversion of nature, which made flowers blow in January and grapes ripen in December. While the kingdom of Soissons was the scene of such horrid transactions, the kings of Austrasia and Burgundy had a meeting at Pont-Pierre, a small village on the Meuse, for the purpose of forming an alliance both sincere and durable. While the kingdom of Gontran, who had lost 2 sons, adopted Chilperic and declared him sole heir to his dominions. The Austrasians, proud of this alliance, sent to demand from Chilperic the restoration of those places which he had taken from them, particularly Poitiers, which he had lately seized. The ambassador had orders in case of refusal, orders to declare war against him. His demands, however, were rejected, and his menaces despised, while the court of Metz quietly put up with the insult and took no pains to resent it. But it is conjectured that with great probability that it instigated Waureau, Earl of Brittany, to refuse to pay homage to the King of Soissons, which refusal produced a bloody war. That continued for some time, and how it terminated is not known. So a lot of this time was really conjured up by this Frederic, we'll call her Fredegonda. I'm going to put a break on this one. We're at page 62. History of France. We're entering into 584 AD.